Dawn broke over Okinawa on the 25th of May, 1945. The sea was calm, the radar screens alive. 47 Japanese aircraft appeared, small green echoes creeping toward the American fleet. On the carrier USS Bunker Hill, sailors watched the dots multiply. What they could not see was what those pilots had eaten only hours earlier: rice balls, miso soup, pickled radish. It was the breakfast of men preparing to die. By mid-1945, Japan's food system had collapsed, its ships sunk, its cities starving. Yet these young pilots still climbed into cockpits, fueled more by belief than by nourishment. They lifted off with empty stomachs and full hearts, convinced that duty could replace calories. They would vanish into fire within the hour. This is not just the story of suicide missions, it is the story of how hunger became ritual, and ritual became a nation's final meal. By the spring of World War II's final year, Japan was fighting on fumes, its empire strangled by American submarines and air raids. Merchant ships that once carried rice from Korea and Taiwan lay scattered across the Pacific floor. The nation's fields could not feed its soldiers, let alone its civilians. Still, from the airfields of Kyushu, waves of pilots took flight each dawn, bound for the American invasion fleet off Okinawa. American intelligence officers at Guam and Pearl Harbor watched with disbelief. Every intercepted report told the same story. The enemy's rations were shrinking, their bases cultivating sweet potatoes between runways, their pilots visibly malnourished. And yet, somehow, they kept coming. To the American mind, a hungry soldier was a defeated soldier, but Japan's warriors proved that starvation could be sanctified. Photographs recovered after the war showed the reality behind the myth. No grand banquets, no overflowing cups of sake, only plain rice, weak miso, and silence. Sometimes even the sake was replaced by green tea. The form mattered more than the content. The ceremony mattered more than the food. This was not the luxury of choice. It was the last ritual of a nation unraveling, performed with the grace of people determined to hold meaning when everything else was gone. The Kamikaze's final meal revealed more than desperation. It exposed the core of Japan's wartime ideology, that honor could outlast hunger and faith could sustain the body when food no longer could. Stay with us, because what you are about to hear is not just about war. It is about the line between survival and belief, about how a bowl of rice eaten in silence became the closing chapter of World War II. By the autumn of 1944, Japan was starving in silence. Not just its people, its empire, its armies, its very idea of invincibility. The Pacific had turned from empire's frontier to its graveyard. Beneath its gray surface, American submarines stalked Japan's supply routes, invisible, methodical, relentless. From Pearl Harbor, Fremantle, and Brisbane, they sailed into the shipping lanes like ghosts. They carried no banners, no glory, only mathematics. 1 torpedo per 1,000 tons of rice, 1 patrol per million empty stomachs. Each sinking was a subtraction from Japan's lifeline. Commander Dudley Morton's USS Wahoo led the way. In just 7 patrols, it destroyed 20 enemy ships, 60,000 tons of cargo gone. Those numbers were more than military success. They were famine made measurable. By early 1945, Japan's imports had collapsed beyond recovery. Rice from Korea and Taiwan, down 92%. Soybeans from Manchuria, nearly erased. Sugar from Taiwan, none. The empire, once industrial and modern, had become a starving island. Inside American intelligence offices at Guam and Pearl Harbor, analysts studied the enemy's decline like doctors watching a patient die. Charts and graphs replaced battle maps. Every line trended downward: food, fuel, morale. On paper, Japan was finished, but paper could not measure faith. Because the Japanese did not surrender to hunger, they transformed it into discipline. They turned starvation into structure, scarcity into ceremony. The empire learned to worship deprivation. In Tokyo, the government announced spiritual preparedness. Citizens were told that endurance, not food, would sustain victory. Radio broadcasts praised mothers who fed their children half portions so that soldiers could eat. but even the soldiers were starving. By January 1945, military rations had dropped to 2,000 calories a day. Civilians survived on 1,400. For comparison, the average American soldier in the Pacific consumed 4,000. That difference, 2,000 calories, was the distance between power and collapse. Yet the Japanese command refused to admit defeat. When the last freighters sank, they replaced imports with ideology. They told the people, "The body may weaken, but the spirit grows stronger in hunger." It was not science, it was survival. At airfields across Kyushu, Kenoya, Chiran, Kushira, pilots trained beside vegetable gardens. Between the runways, cabbage and sweet potatoes grew in narrow plots, watered by the same hands that fueled the Zero fighters. Photographs captured by American reconnaissance showed this bizarre coexistence, agriculture and aviation side by side, roots beneath wings. To the Americans, it looked absurd. To the Japanese, it was adaptation. Commander James Thompson, an American intelligence officer, described the paradox in his Guam report. The enemy subsists on pre-industrial food systems while operating modern aircraft. They farm beneath the shadows of their planes. His words captured more than logistics. They captured tragedy. A modern nation reverting to agrarian survival while still fighting an industrial war. For the pilots themselves, hunger was not failure, it was familiar. Their diaries rarely mentioned suffering. They wrote instead of routine: rice, miso, pickles. Lieutenant Fahiro Hayashi, stationed at Kenoya, recorded his meals like scripture. Morning, rice with barley, miso soup, 2 pickled plums. Noon, rice ball, seaweed tea. Evening, porridge, dried fish. Nothing more. No complaints, no despair. Each line written with the same quiet precision as his flight logs. The American translators who examined these diaries felt something unsettling, a stillness they could not define. There was no rage, no bitterness, no desperation. Only acceptance. Starvation had become ordinary, even sacred. By February, the Sasebo Naval District reported severe shortages. Food deliveries fulfilled 60% of requests in January, 45% in February, 32% in March. And yet, kamikaze operations increased. The empire was burning through its final reserves, not of rice, but of willpower. From Washington's perspective, it made no sense. How could a starving nation intensify its attacks? How could men fly suicide missions on 900 calories? But logic no longer applied. Hunger was no longer a condition. It was an ideology. In one intercepted message, a Japanese officer wrote to his superior, "Our bodies are weak, but our hearts are strong. Rice is short, but devotion is endless." To the Americans, it sounded poetic. To the Japanese, it was policy. Inside the barracks, rituals replaced nourishment. Before each meal, pilots bowed twice, once to the emperor, once to the farmers who had grown the rice. Even when the rice was mixed with potato and seawater, the bow remained the same. Form replaced flavor. Ceremony replaced substance. Commander Thompson summarized it bluntly. The enemy substitutes ideology for calories. In those 7 words, he described the psychological engine of Japan's final year. American intelligence began tracking not just shipments, but beliefs. They noted how hunger propaganda shifted language. Words like shortage were replaced with purification. Rations were renamed gifts. Famine became faith. The government had turned starvation into a sermon, and the people believed. From the cities to the countryside, citizens accepted their hunger as part of the nation's moral economy. To complain was unpatriotic. To endure was divine. The empire had turned the human body into a battlefield, and hunger was victory. Meanwhile, on American carriers, the contrast bordered on surreal. Pilots aboard the USS Enterprise enjoyed eggs, bacon, toast, butter, and orange juice before missions. They joked in the mess hall, sipping coffee from metal cups. To them, food was comfort, a reminder of home. To their opponents, food was memory, fleeting, symbolic, sacred. The caloric difference became a metaphor for the war itself. The United States fought with abundance. Japan fought with absence. One side measured strength in tons of cargo, the other measured it in endurance per ounce of rice. When Operation Starvation began, the mining of Japan's coastal waters by B-29 bombers, the last arteries of trade were severed. Merchant shipping collapsed. Rice could no longer move from farms to cities, from ports to bases. The empire's own geography turned against it. Islands surrounded by ocean, but dying of thirst. By April, the reports from the Ministry of Agriculture were desperate. Civilian rations fell below 1,200 calories. Tokyo's population relied on black market rice, costing 150 yen per kilogram, more than a month's wage. Still, the broadcasts declared optimism. Victory is near, the radio said, but in the kitchens, miso thinned into water. For many Japanese families, the line between life and ritual blurred. Mothers performed the act of cooking long after there was nothing left to cook. Boiled bark, roasted weeds, ground acorns, all arranged neatly on plates as if presentation could preserve dignity. Hunger was not only physical, it was theatrical, and the nation played its role perfectly. In Kyushu's airfields, the same performance repeated every dawn. Pilots lined up for inspection, bowed, saluted, ate. They smiled for the base photographers, holding rice balls shaped with precision. The photographs became propaganda, proof that morale remained high. But behind the lens stood cooks who knew the truth. There was barely enough for another day. One captured officer confessed after the war. "We knew it was over when the rice ran out, but the ceremony could not stop. Without it, we would fall apart." That ceremony, the bow, the rice ball, the sip of tea, became the glue holding a collapsing empire together. In hunger, they found order. In order, they found identity. And in that identity, they found the courage to die. By May 1945, Japan was still flying missions, still producing propaganda, still pretending to eat. But the empire was hollow. Its factories starved of metal, its cities starved of food, its soldiers starved of hope. Only the ritual remained. For the Americans, victory seemed inevitable. For the Japanese, surrender was impossible. Between those two certainties lay the void, a nation feeding its faith because it could no longer feed its people. And from that void would come the final, most haunting chapter of all, when food vanished completely, meaning itself became the last meal. At dawn, the air over Kyushu was cold and clear. The rising sun turned the hangars gold, and the sound of wooden sandals echoed down the corridor of the mess hall. Inside, young men sat cross-legged before metal bowls, steam curling from what little food they had left. No speeches, no orders, only the sound of eating, soft, rhythmic, reverent. It was not a breakfast, it was a ceremony. This was the Tokubetsu Shokuji, the special meal, the last meal. American intelligence first believed these were elaborate send-offs, feasts for heroes about to die. Captured photographs shattered that illusion. There were no banquets, no decorations, no generals delivering toasts, just rows of thin men in flight suits eating rice and miso soup with quiet precision. The room was filled not with pride, but with calm. It looked less like a military ritual and more like a funeral rehearsal. For the Kamikaze pilots, food had long ceased to be nourishment. By 1945, the empire had nothing left to give them except ritual. And so the act of eating, once ordinary, became sacred. Each item on the tray carried meaning. The rice ball symbolized purity, the pickled plum, courage, the miso soup, endurance, and the tea, acceptance. A meal not of flavor, but of philosophy. Sometimes the rice was real. More often it was mixed with barley or grated sweet potato. But the cooks shaped it perfectly, the surface smooth, symmetrical, almost ceremonial. If the rice cracked, they began again. Form mattered more than content. Corporal Tanaka, a cook at Chiran, later told American investigators, "We shaped the rice carefully, even when it was half potato. The pilots had to believe it was pure. They deserved that illusion. His hands had fed death with tenderness. When sake ran out, the bases substituted green tea. When tea ran out, they used hot water, colored faintly with soy residue. And yet the toasts continued. The cups lifted, the heads bowed, the photographs taken. In those images, Americans saw bravery, the Japanese saw completion. The ritual was not about death, it was about order. Even at the end of the world, the empire demanded perfection. If a pilot's last meal was beautiful, then the empire still lived. Lieutenant Hajime Fuji wrote in his diary, the night before his final mission. The commander said, "Eat slowly, feel gratitude. The smell of earth and soup made me think of home. I bowed before eating. It felt like goodbye." His last act of living was not flight, it was eating with grace. At Kenoya Air Base, the meal began before dawn. Cooks started the fires at 3 in the morning, boiling miso that was more water than paste. They lined the tables with wooden bowls, each filled with precisely the same amount. 200 grams of rice, diluted with 40% sweet potato, 1 slice of pickled radish, a cup of green tea, no salt, no fish, no oil. Just austerity served with ceremony. By the time the pilots entered the mess hall, the air smelled faintly of smoke and fermented soy. They bowed to the emperor's portrait, then to the cooks, then to each other. For a few moments, there was peace. The war existed outside the door. Inside, there was only the rhythm of chopsticks. American pilots aboard the USS Enterprise ate eggs, bacon, toast, and butter before takeoff. They joked, they cursed, they chewed quickly. Their enemy ate in silence, their movements synchronized, deliberate. Both would meet in the same sky within hours, one full, one hungry, both doomed. To Western eyes, hunger symbolized weakness. To the Japanese, it proved strength. Starvation purified the act of dying. A man who ate little, yet still performed perfectly, embodied the empire's spirit. His empty stomach became a weapon of faith. Captain William Sebald, a Japan expert on General MacArthur's staff, initially misinterpreted the ritual. He wrote, "These must be feasts of honor, farewell banquets for martyrs." But intelligence photographs told another story. No abundance, no music, only quiet faces bent over small bowls. When Sebald finally saw the reality, he admitted, it was not celebration, it was resignation performed beautifully. That beauty was deliberate. The Japanese military believed that even in collapse, the appearance of control preserved the nation's dignity. To eat beautifully was to die beautifully. At Chiran, witnesses described the atmosphere as almost monastic. Pilots often refused second helpings, even when food was available. Some said they wanted to leave more for the next group. Others simply believed gluttony dishonored the cause. Moderation was patriotism, self-denial, salvation. American interrogators later marveled at this discipline. How could men so malnourished still stand, still smile, still bow? The answer lay not in calories, but in conviction. They were sustained by a belief that transcendence required emptiness. The less they possessed, the closer they were to purity. One captured document from the Imperial Navy's guidance manual read, "The warrior spirit transcends the body. Hunger clarifies the soul. Let not abundance cloud your resolve." In those lines, starvation became theology. When the ceremonial meals ended, the pilots walked in pairs toward their aircraft. Ground crews lined the path, bowing as they passed. Civilians from nearby villages stood silently, some weeping, others smiling faintly. The smell of rice and miso lingered in the air, fading as the engines roared to life. Then, silence again. An entire nation holding its breath between spoonfuls and explosions. At Okinawa, the Americans felt the result of those rituals. Every kamikaze dive, every burning ship, every explosion carried the weight of that meal. Men who had eaten rice and tea hours before now turned themselves into fire. They flew not on fuel, but on faith. And that faith, that cold, controlled devotion, terrified even the victors. Lieutenant Commander Edward O'Hare, reporting after an attack on Task Force 58, wrote, "They fly straight through flak that would turn back any normal pilot. No evasive action, just straight lines to death." He did not know that those men had eaten their last meal before sunrise, a bowl of rice, watered miso, pickled vegetables, and bowed before leaving the earth forever. To the Americans, the kamikaze was a mystery. To the Japanese, it was choreography. The meal, the bow, the flight, one seamless ritual from nourishment to annihilation. By May 1945, the empire had formalized even starvation. Naval Intelligence Bulletin 45-7 described the standard last meal: rice balls wrapped in seaweed, miso soup with tofu when available, one pickled plum, green tea, no alcohol, no dessert. It was an instruction manual for devotion disguised as a menu. In one sense, it was logistics. In another, it was philosophy. The empire was teaching its soldiers how to die beautifully on an empty stomach. When American occupation forces finally entered the abandoned bases, they found the remnants of these ceremonies: empty bowls, burnt wooden spoons, teacups carefully arranged as if waiting for the next group. They expected to find hidden stores of food, evidence of deceit. They found none. There had never been enough to hide. In one mess hall, investigators discovered a faded poster on the wall. It read, "A full heart needs no full stomach." That was the empire's epitaph. For the Kamikaze, the last meal was not about dying well. It was about proving the empire still had form, even when it had lost substance. Japan could no longer feed its soldiers, but it could still teach them grace. And in that grace, the nation found its final illusion of control. The irony, of course, is that the Americans, who saw the enemy as fanatics, also ritualized food in their own way. On ships, sailors gathered for prayer before meals. Pilots refused to fly without coffee, calling it their liquid courage. Both sides, in their own languages, sanctified the act of eating before death. But only one side was starving, and so the contrast became cosmic: abundance facing emptiness, luxury facing devotion, the modern world colliding with a civilization that believed hunger itself could be holy. The Kamikaze's last meal became the most haunting symbol of Japan's final year. Not a feast of fanaticism, but a quiet confession of exhaustion. A dying empire preserving manners while losing meaning. A nation saying goodbye through rice and tea. Because in the end, the last meal was not about what they ate. It was about what they refused to surrender, the belief that order could outlast chaos, that ritual could redeem defeat, that beauty could survive hunger. The men of Chiran, Kenoya, and Kenoya did not die with full stomachs. They died believing that discipline itself could replace food. And in that belief, terrible, beautiful, futile. The empire consumed the last of itself. By the spring of 1945, Japan was no longer a nation of warriors. It was a nation of the hungry. Cities smoldered, farms flooded, trains stopped, and the ocean, once the empire's highway, had become a mode of death. But in the small towns and mountain villages near Kyushu's airfields, life continued in the strangest way possible. The people kept cooking. They cooked for the dead. In Chiran, the airfield stretched between fields of sweet potatoes and barley, crops that had replaced rice as famine tightened its grip. From these same fields came the last food the Kamikaze pilots would ever eat. Every morning before sunrise, villagers arrived at the base gates carrying bundles wrapped in cloth, rice balls, pickled vegetables, sometimes a single egg. Most had walked miles barefoot. They left their offerings in silence, bowed, and went home to hunger. The Americans, after the war, struggled to understand this. Why would starving civilians feed men whose purpose was to die? To Western logic, it was madness, but in Japan's wartime culture, it was morality. To feed a pilot was to feed the emperor. To sacrifice your meal was to serve the nation. And so, amid the wreckage of the empire, a quiet economy of faith emerged, an exchange of food for meaning. Mrs. Torihara embodied that faith. A 42-year-old widow with 3 children, she owned a small restaurant near the Chiran base. Each day, she prepared meals for the pilots, using her family's entire ration and whatever she could find on the black market. Eggs cost more than her monthly income. Rice, 10 times more. Her family survived on sweet potato peels, yet she never stopped feeding the young men. When American investigators interviewed her in 1946, she said softly, "They were boys. I could not let them go hungry. That would have been shame." Shame, Haji, was the moral axis of wartime Japan. To eat while soldiers starved was dishonor. To share your hunger was purity. In a twisted inversion of morality, starvation became a source of pride. Villages competed not in wealth, but in sacrifice. OSS field reports read like ledgers of collective suffering. 127 eggs, 45 kilograms of vegetables, 12 chickens, 200 rice balls, all donated by residents of Chiran district. The analysts added a note. Local population near starvation. Donations continue regardless. Each number represented a story. A farmer's wife who sold her wedding ring for rice, a teacher who bartered textbooks for cabbages, an elderly couple who gave up their only chicken. Every act fed someone who would die within days. For the villagers, this was not insanity, it was continuity. For centuries, Japanese social life had been guided by giri, the bond of obligation. In war, giri became nationalized. The soldier owed his life to the emperor. The civilian owed her hunger to the soldier. It was a moral circle that devoured itself. Lieutenant Matsuo, one of the Kamikaze pilots, wrote in his final letter, "The villagers gave us eggs today. The children here have not seen eggs in months. This gift is heavier than any bomb. I must fly well." To the Americans who intercepted that letter, it was proof of fanaticism. To the Japanese, it was proof of love. The paradox haunted U.S. intelligence officers at Guam. They called it irrational altruism. But one cultural analyst saw something else. He wrote, "The Japanese replace material wealth with moral wealth. Hunger becomes currency. Self-denial purchases meaning." It was the most dangerous kind of patriotism, the kind that sanctified suffering. By May, the donations had become smaller. Eggs disappeared. Vegetables were rare. Still, people came to the base gates with what little they had, sometimes just pickled radish, sometimes only a smile. When the guards refused their offerings, they left them on the ground and bowed. The next morning, the food was gone. For many, the act of giving was the last link to normal life. In a world where war had taken everything, generosity became resistance. They could not fight, could not flee, could not win, but they could feed. Feeding was a way to remain human. When Japan's surrender came in August, many villagers did not celebrate. They sat quietly, unsure how to live without the ritual that had defined their days. For months they had cooked for the dead. Now, even that duty was gone. When American occupation teams arrived, they found the same faces waiting at the gates, still offering rice balls to strangers. They had not yet learned that the war was over. In interviews, one farmer explained, "We gave food to the pilots so they would not die hungry. Now we give it to the Americans so they will not hate us." It was the same instinct, turned toward a new master. To the Americans, the gesture was astonishing. After years of bombardment, these villagers greeted their conquerors not with anger, but with hospitality. Hunger had taught them compassion, yet the cost of that compassion had been unbearable. When the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey analyzed Japan's home front conditions, it concluded that by July 1945, the entire nation was within weeks of famine. Rice production had fallen to half of pre-war levels. Urban calories averaged barely 1,200 a day. In some rural prefectures, less than 1,000. Japan had survived not through supply, but through shared starvation. Even after surrender, that starvation continued. In 1946, civilians received rations of 1,290 calories per day, almost identical to what their soldiers had eaten before dying. But something had changed. The meaning. Hunger was no longer patriotic. It was simply hunger. And slowly, that realization began to heal the nation. The same people who once fed kamikaze pilots now stood in line for American food aid, milk powder, wheat, sugar. For the first time, the gift of food came without expectation, without ritual, without ideology. It was sustenance, not sacrifice. The nation learned to eat again. Mrs. Torihara's restaurant reopened in 1947. She served American bread and coffee to occupation officers and rice to local farmers. On her wall hung a photograph of the Chiran pilots, young, smiling, almost childlike. When asked why she kept it, she said, "They remind me that food is not glory. It is kindness." That kindness became Japan's quiet redemption. The empire that had glorified death was reborn through generosity. The same hands that once offered rice to dying boys now built a new world from ashes and grain. By the 1950s, Japan's economy began to recover. Factories reopened, farms mechanized, trains ran again. But in Chiran and Kenoya, the memory of those last meals never faded. Each spring, when the cherry blossoms bloomed, villagers gathered to prepare rice balls, not for soldiers, but for remembrance. They placed them at the old airfield, under the trees where the pilots had once walked. No prayers for victory, only silence for peace. To outsiders, these ceremonies might seem simple. To the survivors, they were sacred, because they understood what the world often forgets, that food is never just food. It is memory. It is apology. It is the language of forgiveness spoken by the starving. The people who fed the dead did not build monuments. They built meals. They preserved peace not in marble, but in kitchens. Their war ended not with surrender, but with a plate of rice offered to anyone who was hungry. And in that quiet act, humble, human, enduring, Japan found its truest victory. For while the empire had once sought eternity through death, its people discovered something greater, that to feed, even when you have nothing, is the purest form of resistance against the cruelty of war. That was how the starving defeated despair. That was how the living honored the dead. And that was how Japan, the nation that ate itself, learned to feed the world again. When the guns finally fell silent on August 15, 1945, Japan was a nation of ghosts. Cities had turned to ash, villages lay empty. The emperor's voice trembled across the radio, soft, distant, almost unreal. For years, the Japanese people had been told their empire was eternal, but empires, like bodies, die from within. Japan's end came not from the bombs nor from the fire, but from hunger. In the months that followed, American occupation forces uncovered the truth of that hunger. They found notebooks of base cooks detailing rations reduced to almost nothing, flight logs marked with the word "meal complete" beside pilots who never returned. They found families still keeping the empty bowls from the Kamikaze's Last Supper, washed and stored like relics. No gold, no victory, only rice and remembrance. The Strategic Bombing Survey called it the starvation of an island nation. But the phrase missed something deeper. This was not only physical starvation, it was moral exhaustion, the collapse of substance, the triumph of form. An entire civilization had turned ceremony into survival. To the outside world, it looked like madness. Inside Japan, it felt like faith. World War II ended not just in surrender, but in revelation. It showed how ideology could consume a nation more completely than any firestorm. It revealed that the greatest weapon of the modern age was not the bomb, but belief. The Japanese had fought the war of spirit against the world of substance and lost. Yet even in that loss, there was something enduring, the stubborn dignity of a people who continued to bow, to cook, to share, even when the world had collapsed around them. When American soldiers walked through the ruins of Kyushu's airfields, they expected to find hate in the eyes of the survivors. Instead, they found humility. Cooks, farmers, mothers, the same people who had fed the dead, now offered tea to their former enemies. They had no bitterness left to give, only kindness. Starvation had stripped away ideology, leaving behind something purer than nationalism, humanity itself. Perhaps that is the final paradox of World War II. A war fought in the name of empire ended by teaching the value of compassion. A nation that once worshipped death learned through hunger the sanctity of life. And the people who once fed the dying would become, in the post-war years, the builders of a new peace, one defined not by conquest, but by endurance. Today, Japan stands as one of the most peaceful nations on earth. Its cities hum with life, its tables overflow with food. But every grain of rice, every cup of tea, carries the memory of those who ate in silence before flying to die. In that memory lies a warning and a lesson. If millions had to die for peace, what will we do to protect it today? History has already shown the cost of silence. Will we raise our voices for compassion before hunger returns, before ideology once again devours humanity from within? Because the story of those final meals is not only Japan's story, it is ours. Every nation faces the temptation to choose pride over empathy, power over kindness, and every generation must decide whether to feed its soldiers or its conscience. The war ended 80 years ago, but the question remains: what does it mean to eat in peace when the world still hungers for meaning? World War II began with ambition and ended with starvation. From that emptiness rose a single truth, that food, faith, and freedom are inseparable. When we forget that, war begins again. So the next time you sit before a meal, a bowl of rice, a piece of bread, a cup of tea, remember the young men of Kyushu and the mothers who fed them. Remember how a nation tried to fill its emptiness with ritual. And remember that peace, like food, must be cultivated, shared, and protected. Because World War II may have ended in 1945, but the fight for peace, for compassion, for justice, for freedom, never ends.